The film does juggle a lot of characters. We also get Boris, the brains behind the big plan. Alan Cummings gives an amusing performance as the arrogant Russian computer mastermind who loves word games.
They're right in front of you and can open very large doors.
You're such a geek.
The one thing I always thought was weird was all his word games and passwords are in English. Wouldn't they be in Russian? Of course, in such a mainstream popular film, having a Russian character actually speak Russian would alienate the general audience with having to read subtitles. A lot of people are turned off by that chore. So it's easier just to make all the characters speak English with a Russian accent, even though it would be more realistic if they were speaking their native language.
What else do you call your bottle?
What?
It's Boris' password. He plays word games. It's what I sit on, but I don't take it with me.
Chair.
So the word game thing I always wondered about. I finally asked a Russian-speaking friend when these English riddles were translated in Russian, would they still be funny, or at least make some kind of sense? According to my comrade, the chair one works, but the knockers one would make no sense at all. It's a small thing, and one could argue that Boris likes playing word games in all languages or something. So these don't necessarily have to be in Russian, but it was always something I thought about when these scenes came up. It's still a clever device to make it more fun when Natalia breaks the code than had it been just a bunch of random numbers.
Burst for brains.
8 years after playing Dalton's nemesis, Brad Whitaker, Joe Don Baker returns to the series playing CIA agent Jack Wade, basically the new Felix Leiter. He fulfills the Felix role by providing Bond with vital information, and his relaxed attitude is a fresh take on a character interacting with Bond. I think it's the first time a character ever calls him Jimbo. We get a new Moneypenny played by Samantha Bond. After years of the required office flirting, we get the first mention of sexual harassment. But that's really the only thing that's worth mentioning from their short scene together. It's pretty forgettable.
James Bond. Charming, sophisticated secret agent. Shaken but not disturbed.
Robbie Coltran as a Russian mobster who has a history with Bond. The whole idea of former enemies are now allies is played out here, with Bond having to go to Valentine for information. This is one aspect of the film that could have been taken advantage of more. The whole dramatic change in Bond's world and Bond finding himself having to adapt to it. Coltrane is funny, and the scene is effective. It moves Bond along in the story and gives us some exposition. Lastly, we get the return of Q.
Morning, Q. Sorry about the leg. Skiing?
Hunting.
At this point, Desmond Llewelyn was 81 years old, and his appearance had become a requirement to the series. So it was completely understandable why he was included in the film, and it was nice to see him alive and well. Understandably, at this point, Llewellyn's ability to memorize all the technical dialogue he's meant to say was probably pretty difficult. The solution to this of allowing him to read off cue cards or a monitor is clearly evident. You can see him looking off screen, and it dilutes some of the fun of the normally entertaining scene. Q had always been a cranky character when it came to Bond. Bond not being respectful of his equipment, destroying it, and cracking jokes during the briefings. This relationship worked better when Bond and Q were a little bit closer in age. Now seeing a young man ride an older one doesn't seem as funny as it does cruel. This is lightened up a bit by allowing Q to play along with Bond's jokes more than he had done in the past.
Oh, grow up, 007.
They all said the pen was mightier than the sword.
Thanks to me, they were right.
Giving him a couple of one-liners of his own and almost enjoying their interaction more than in past Q scenes.
Don't say it.
The writing's on the wall?
Along with the rest of it.
By the way, I immediately experienced deja vu at the final joke of this scene.
Do please try and return some of this equipment in pristine order. Don't touch that. It's my lunch.
It's a very similar joke to the one used in the Q scene in Never Say Never Again. One that I thought was executed better and funnier, actually.
What is this for? I'll show you. You unscrew it, then stick it up your nose. It's for my sinus.
Again, Brosnan seems like he's trying way too hard to be funny in this scene. His reaction to Q grabbing the sandwich from him, he just looks so stiff. Anyway, back to the story. The GoldenEye, a device used to control a satellite weapon, is stolen. General Ormov and Xenia kill all the radar workers while Natalia manages to survive. A really violent and intense scene, whose highlight is the vulnerable Natalia avoiding death as this radar station comes falling down around her. I think it's actually the best action scene in the entire film. Bond begins to follow leads to track down Yanis, head of this crime syndicate that is suspected behind all this. Bond gets a surprise visit by Xenia in a steam room, where she tries to kill him. She's at her sexy, sadistic best in this scene. Brosnan actually seems pretty vulnerable against her. I'm not convinced he realistically would manage to survive this encounter. If there was a battle royale of Bonds, all fighting it out in a ring, I think Pierce's Bond would be the first one out. Okay, well, I'll give him taking out Roger Moore. But Roger would at least have a funny one-liner before getting pummeled. But soon after that, Pierce would follow. I think Brosnan gets his best Bond quips in this scene. Most of the Bond witty remarks and one-liners in the film are not really that good.
The things we do for frequent flyer mileage.
They're not that creative or funny, and they just seem to be there because they're supposed to be. Finally, we get the return of Alec, who reveals himself as Yanis. Alec and Bond's scene set in the Monument Graveyard is a unique location for their reunion. It's not exactly a subtle setting as to the major theme in the film, but still, it's pretty cool. Once again, Bean comes out of the darkness, similar to his first introduction in the beginning of the film. The inevitable reveal is played out nicely, and both Bean and Brosnan do a pretty good job with the scene. It becomes one of the better scenes of the standard villain explaining things. But as the film moves on, his reasons for his big plan become less clear.
And in one of life's little ironies, the son went to work for the government whose betrayal caused the father to kill himself and his wife.
This is true. What's true is that in 48 hours, you and I will have more money than God.
The world's greatest cash card. It had better not be rejected.
So I'm not really sure if he's after money or revenge or what. It is kind of odd after all the talk of updating 007 for the post-Cold War era and the 90s. One of Alec's motivations for wanting revenge dates back to World War II. Alec's speech describing Bond as a loyal terrier and revealing a little information about the death of Bond's parents,
but where your parents had the luxury of dying in a climbing accident,
helped make the scene even more memorable. But Bean is pretty good. It's not often that the Bond villain is Bond's physical equal, so that aspect can get exploited for the final fight between them. It's more exciting than the villain just pushing buttons and being kind of a stagnant participant relying on his henchmen to do the dirty work. Bean was one of the candidates for the new Bond, and with that in mind, I can't help but think how different the film and this run in the series would have been had the roles here been reversed. Bean as the new 007 and playing against everyone's good guy, leading contender of being Bond expectations, Brosnan as the evil 006. I'm not sure how it would have worked, but I bet Brosnan would have been more fun to watch as a Bond bad guy than the bland Bond he's playing here. One thing the film really tries to deliver on is the action. There is a lot of machine gun fire. I think Brosnan uses more machine guns in his run than all the other Bonds combined. You almost forget about his Walther PPK. almost becomes his signature during his Bond run. A lot of machine gun firing and diving out of explosions. The library shootout is choreographed pretty well, with lots of squibs going off and Bond firing away at any soldier he sees. The biggest set piece is the tank chase in St. Petersburg, and while it's a first in a Bond film, I think it gets pretty boring pretty fast. Chase scenes are a staple in Bond films. Bond is either going to be running from or chasing some bad guys at some point. A lot of times he'll do this in a vehicle, possibly one of Q's gadget-filled cars. One of the exciting things about a chase is not only the speed and destruction, but the obstacles that you have to navigate around while being in your vehicle. With a tank, that element is kind of taken away. Bond doesn't have to worry about running into the giant Perrier truck. He can just barrel right through it, especially if it's loaded with obvious empty Perrier cans. He goes through buildings, runs over cars, so the tank chase becomes more of a demolition sequence than anything else, and I just don't find it as thrilling as other past chases. I like how they add the throwaway shots of these drivers getting out of their smashed vehicles, so we know that Bond didn't just kill them. Even the nonsensical destructive chases in A View to a Kill, with Roger Moore tearing apart Paris and San Francisco, I think are more fun, with Roger having to avoid other cars and pedestrians and trolley cars. I can at least enjoy the staging and driving maneuvers and see that Bond is constantly in jeopardy. Here it's more like, oh yeah, he just plowed through the wall and ran over some police cars. There's not a lot of danger Bond is in during the whole thing. It almost is a perfect metaphor for Brosnan's Bond. A guy who never seems to be in any kind of danger and is just laying a lot of destruction behind him. He's more of a Superman character than a vulnerable secret agent. The train sequence is much better, as Bond uses the tank to derail the train. It's all nicely put together, along with Xenia getting turned on by the whole idea.
Only Bond.
He's going to derail us.
It culminates with Bond being forced to make a decision between killing Alec or saving Natalia. He kills Ormov, Alec and Xenia escape, and he and Natalia get trapped in the locked train that's wired to blow. The classic Bond device of the ticking clock. It's a cool suspenseful scene with Bond trying to cut a hole in the floor and Natalia trying to track down Boris. Their exchanges are funny, and she's not just a scared damsel waiting to be saved, but is barking orders at him, and has a nice edge to her. Actually, Bond seems more panicked to get out of there than she is. They manage to cut their way out of the train, and it's the first and best of the many Brosnan diving from an explosion escapes. Bond and Natalia are naturally going to work together for the rest of the film, so they head off to Cuba. Before heading to the climax of the film, there's a pit stop for a very melodramatic scene on a beach. This is an attempt to get a little closer examination of Bond, as he's now forced to set about killing his former friend. It's a pretty clunky scene, with Brosnan's melodramatic line readings.
How can you act like this? How can you be so cold?
It's what keeps me alive.
It's very soap opera-y. Immediately, the required sex scene follows. We head to the showdown, with Bond and Natalia searching for Alec's big dish. The blue screen and miniatures are obvious, but it still sells the sequence pretty effectively. This segues to the return and end of Xenia. With Bond still recovering from the plane crash, she seems more than capable of killing him. He takes care of her with the help of another machine gun. Her inevitable death is alright. It's not as grisly a death as past henchmen or women have gotten. Bond's required quip. It did look like the film was going to do the cliched device of making her seem like she's dead, but then suddenly having her pop up later in the film. But no, I guess she's really dead. The big antenna miniatures in the inside set are reminiscent of the old classic Bond villains, especially Blofeld's volcano hideout. A lot of TV screens, different levels, a lot of workers milling about, and all of it just waiting to get destroyed. Alec throws in some more psychological insight into Bond. Some pretty good ones.
I might as well ask you if all the vodka martinis ever silenced the screams of all the men you've killed. Or if you find forgiveness in the arms of all those willing women, for all the dead ones you failed to protect.
His former 00 knowledge about Q's toys easily dismantles Bond's initial plan of setting off his explosives. Natalia shows off some of her toughness again, and she's the one ultimately responsible for destroying the GoldenEye. Which leads us to a very suspenseful scene of Q's pen finally being used, this time by the unsuspecting Boris. Brosnan, for one of the few times, really looks helpless as he just stands by trying to keep track of the pen clicks. It really amps up the tension. I'm not sure if the actual number of clicks we see and hear is the right number, but it doesn't matter. It's still a nice tense scene and leads to the required destruction of the villain's lair. The final showdown between Bond and Alec is well staged on top of the antenna, with again plenty of machine gun fire and running around, but nothing extraordinarily memorable. As expected, their final exchange mirrors what they said at the beginning of the film, as Bond drops Alec to his death. The blue screening here again looks kinda fakey, but Alec's impact on the ground is pretty brutal for a Bond film.
Suppose someone is worth seeing.
There's no one within 25 miles, believe me.
Yo, Jimbo!
There's no Bond water ending here, but they do the old "no one is around to see us" gag. I like GoldenEye, but I don't think it's as great as some proclaim it to be. It's a nice updating of the classic Bond film formula. It has a cool eclectic mix of bad guys, the Bond girl, the femme fatale, Bond's allies. They're all really good. The post-Cold War setting gives a nice atmosphere to everything, and Martin Campbell gets a nice balance between the drama, action, and the humor. I think one of the problems general audiences had with the Dalton films was the cutting back of the more incredible and fun aspects the series had become known for. Watching Dalton's films, some people were probably wondering, why don't they have a guy with metal teeth or something? GoldenEye found that nice balance of providing that aspect of the silly and over-the-top, like Xenia with her nutcracker thighs, while not getting too campy and being able to maintain a grounded reality. There are instances when the things get a little too ridiculous for my taste, but overall I think the film was designed to appeal to everyone. Fans who like their dramatic espionage Bond films, and ones who just want a purely escapist adventure. And GoldenEye succeeds in that regard. But for me, the film isn't perfect and has some key shortcomings. The biggest one is the villain. On paper, it sounds so great. 007 versus 006. Two 00s going head to head. It has the makings of one of the best conflicts the series could ever have for Bond. What should have been a great epic struggle between them, a battle of wits and skills and brawn, is basically just some brawn, with firing some machine guns at each other. It's kinda disappointing. Other than the graveyard scene, Alec and Bond don't really have any great scenes. Their encounters seem way too brief, and the whole build-up between them, waiting for their final confrontation and how it's going to play out, is kind of a letdown. The climax doesn't consist of a unique face-off between Bond and another 00. but just becomes Bond against a generic bad guy villain. Then there's no really great memorable action set pieces or stunts, other than the bungee jump. The rest is by the number shootouts, destruction, and explosions with no real style. The locations aren't really utilized in any original ways. A lot of them simply look like matte paintings or recreated on sets than actual real places. It kind of makes the film look cheap in spots. And then we have Brosnan's one-note performance in the middle of it all. Like I said in the beginning, I am not one of Brosnan's fans, and for me he looks very stiff and awkward and just appears trying way too hard to fill the role the whole time. And for me, he doesn't. He's given all the Bond notes to play. The action, the humor, the sophistication. He has a few moments where he comes off natural in the role, but watching him throughout the entire film, nothing about him on screen really jumps out at me. And I don't think he does any one particular Bond characteristic really well. He's just very unexciting. As the lead character in the film, he's much less interesting and fun to watch than the supporting characters around him. The film overall isn't a bad debut, but simply average. Based on his performance in GoldenEye, Brosnan didn't look like he would be doing anything new with the character or putting his own spin on him. But it appeared he would follow the same on-screen persona he cultivated years earlier that made him famous. Sort of like a big-budget Remington Steele. Brosnan's GoldenEye Bond is a very robotic performance. Pierce Brosnan as James Bond. And that's about it. The few times the film gives him opportunities to sink his teeth into some meatier scenes, such as the staring off in the distance, much on his mind scene on the beach, he isn't very convincing. Had Dalton stuck around, and this was his third Bond film, would it have been better? I don't know. It's one of the great what-if questions in the series. I do think Dalton is a better actor, and has a wider range than Pierce does, so I think had Dalton starred in GoldenEye, he would have given a more interesting performance than Pierce does here. The story in License to Kill, with Bond out for personal revenge, mined the anger in the character. So I would think a story of 007 being betrayed by his friend, and being forced with the realization he would have to kill him, would have been right up Dalton's alley. And he would have taken advantage of the emotional conflicts the story would have given his character this time around. But who knows? Dalton might be widely considered to be one of the closest portrayals of Fleming's original Bond. But I'm not sure mainstream audiences want that. Or at least at this point in the series. A less darker and more exhilarating adventure, which GoldenEye is, was what the series needed to reinvigorate itself after the 6-year hiatus and the cool reception Dalton had gotten. The timing was right for GoldenEye. When I look at GoldenEye now, it definitely stands out in the Brosnan Age. More for the film itself than Brosnan's debut. Looking at it in the perspective of the entirety of Brosnan's Bond run, it looks and feels more like a holdover film from Dalton than the first sign of where the series would be taken with Brosnan. The story and vision GoldenEye reintroduced Bond into appeared to have plenty of potential for the character and the series. Brosnan waited a long time to be Bond, and he knew the world would be anxiously watching his debut. He didn't really add anything new to his variation on 007. He mainly played it pretty safe. But now, maybe he could relax a bit more, not worry about the ghosts of former Bonds hanging over his head. Try some new things, and make the part his own. But for now, Brosnan worked for a lot of fans. Any doubts that 007 could continue in the post-Cold War era quickly disappeared when GoldenEye became a huge success. Brosnan was credited with saving the series and re-established Bond to his iconic film status. He would become the James Bond for a new generation. Unlike the last seemingly endless 6-year hiatus between films, plans were quickly made for the next 007 adventure. And this time, fans would only have to wait 2 years for Bond to return.
The Prime Minister's talked to Moscow. They're saying it was an accident during a routine training exercise.
Governments change. The lies stay the same.